I have studied the architecture of post-war economic order long enough to recognize that 1945 was not simply the end of a military conflict. It was the beginning of a carefully constructed system where certain nations controlled extraction while others controlled transformation, and that division was maintained through specific structural mechanisms that made changing roles appear impossible. The reasons American control over processing of Canadian critical minerals began in 1945 were not accidental or temporary. They were deliberately constructed and systematically maintained across 8 decades through mechanisms that made Canadian processing economically irrational regardless of Canadian technical capacity or resource wealth. Understanding why 1945 matters requires recognizing what that year represented for global economic architecture. The Bretton Woods Conference established dollar dominance and American centrality in post-war reconstruction. The end of wartime production shifted massive American industrial capacity toward peacetime manufacturing. The Marshall Plan structured European recovery around American supply chains. Every major decision made in 1945 and immediately after positioned the United States as the industrial processor, while resource-rich nations like Canada were positioned as extractors, supplying American transformation capacity. This was not conspiracy. This was rational economic planning based on wartime realities. American industrial capacity had expanded enormously during the war, while other nations' facilities had been destroyed or converted to military production. American capital markets were the only ones functioning at scale sufficient to fund reconstruction. American technical expertise had been concentrated and developed through wartime production demands. The logic appeared unassailable. America possessed processing capacity, capital, and expertise. Other nations possessed resources, but not processing capability. Therefore, American processing of global resources was the natural and efficient post-war arrangement. What made this arrangement self-perpetuating was that the reasons it was rational in 1945 became more entrenched over time, rather than diminishing. American processing facilities, processing Canadian materials from 1945 onward, accumulated operational experience that widened the knowledge gap between American processors and potential Canadian competitors. American capital invested in processing generated returns that funded facility expansion and improvement, increasing the capital barrier facing Canadian entrants. American customer relationships established in the immediate post-war years deepened into supply chain integration that raised switching costs progressively higher. The longer the system operated, the more difficult changing it became, not because of any explicit enforcement, but because the structural reasons enabling it became progressively more overwhelming. By understanding what made American control rational in 1945 and how those reasons compounded over 8 decades, we can understand what Canada systematically removed to end that control. The reasons were never abstract or mysterious. They were specific, identifiable structural conditions, and removing them required systematic investment designed explicitly to make each reason cease to exist. The first reason American control began in 1945 and persisted through 2024 was capital availability asymmetry. American capital markets emerged from World War II as the only ones functioning at scale sufficient to fund major industrial projects. European capital markets were devastated. Canadian capital markets were modest and risk-averse. If you wanted to build billion-dollar processing facilities in 1945, you obtained capital in New York because alternatives simply did not exist at necessary scale. This capital availability advantage meant American companies built processing capacity, while Canadian companies, unable to access equivalent capital, remained confined to extraction. This initial capital advantage compounded over decades as American processing facilities generated returns that funded expansion and modernization, while Canadian extraction operations generated modest margins insufficient to fund processing development. By 2024, American processors operated facilities with fully amortized capital costs, while any Canadian competitor would face full capital burden competing against capital-free American operations. The capital reason that had made American processing rational in 1945 had become progressively more insurmountable through 8 decades of compounding advantage. Canada removed this reason through deployment of $280 billion in strategic capital explicitly allocated to processing infrastructure, without requiring competitive returns during development period. This eliminated the capital asymmetry that had existed since 1945 by providing Canadian facilities with capital on terms competitive with fully amortized American operations. The reason American processing had been capital rational for 80 years ceased to exist when Canadian capital availability matched American capital that had accumulated since 1945. The second reason American control began in 1945 was technical knowledge concentration. Wartime production had concentrated processing expertise in American facilities and personnel. The chemists, metallurgists, and engineers who understood complex separation processes, refining techniques, and quality control systems were overwhelmingly American because wartime demands had forced development of this expertise in American facilities supplying war production. After 1945, this knowledge resided in American companies and American universities, creating a technical monopoly that made American processing not just economically rational, but technically necessary because alternative expertise simply did not exist. This technical knowledge advantage compounded over decades as American facilities continuously improved processes through operational experience, while Canadian extraction companies never developed processing expertise because they never operated processing facilities. By 2024, American processors possessed 80 years of accumulated institutional knowledge embodied in experienced personnel and refined processes. Any Canadian entrant starting from zero would operate initially at dramatically lower efficiency than American competitors, guaranteeing losses until Canadian operations accumulated comparable experience over decades. Canada removed this reason through systematic recruitment of experienced processing engineers from global operations and funding of accelerated learning programs, compressing decades of knowledge accumulation into years of intensive development. Canadian facilities were designed with operational flexibility, allowing simultaneous testing of multiple approaches, accelerating the learning curve. Additional funding supported extended operational optimization periods before facilities needed competitive returns. The technical knowledge gap that had existed since 1945 was systematically closed through investment in human capital and learning infrastructure that replicated 80 years of American knowledge accumulation. The third reason American control began in 1945 was scale economy advantages, established through first mover positioning. American facilities, built immediately after the war, processed the majority of global materials, allowing them to achieve economies of scale that smaller, later entrants could never match. Fixed costs of facilities, equipment, and administration, spread across large volumes, produced per-unit costs that smaller operations could not approach, regardless of operational efficiency. This scale advantage was self-perpetuating because maintaining large scale required maintaining large market share, and losing market share would increase per-unit costs, making competitive pricing to regain share impossible. The scale advantage compounded over decades as American facilities expanded capacity to process growing global demand, while potential competitors remained subscale because they could not capture market share without competitive pricing that was impossible without scale. By 2024, American processors operated at scales so large that competing appeared economically irrational because reaching competitive scale required capturing market share from facilities that could leverage scale advantages to defend positions through pricing that made competition unprofitable. Canada removed this reason by building processing facilities specifically sized to match American scales, rather than starting subscale with plans to expand. $40 billion built lithium processing at scales matching largest American operations globally. $60 billion constructed rare earth capacity comparable to major American refineries. $50 billion funded uranium enrichment at volumes rivaling established plants. The investment was explicitly calculated to eliminate scale disadvantage by matching American capacity established since 1945, rather than attempting to grow incrementally from subscale positions that would confirm American scale advantages. The fourth reason American control began in 1945 was customer relationship entrenchment through supply chain integration. Battery manufacturers, technology companies, and reactor operators structured their procurement and production systems around American supply, beginning immediately after the war. These relationships deepened over decades as customers invested in systems optimized for American supply characteristics. By 2024, switching from American to alternative suppliers required expensive qualification testing, system modifications, and process adjustments that made customer inertia an enormous barrier protecting American market positions, even if alternatives offered better terms. This customer entrenchment compounded over decades as supply relationships established in 1945 evolved into deep integration where customer production systems were designed specifically around American supply specifications. Switching costs rose progressively higher as integration deepened, making customers increasingly locked into American suppliers, regardless of whether alternatives emerged. By 2024, customers maintained American supply relationships not necessarily because American terms were optimal, but because switching costs exceeded potential benefits from adopting alternatives. Canada removed this reason through long-term supply agreements offering volume commitments, pricing security, technical support, and absorption of qualification costs that made switching from American to Canadian supply economically attractive despite integration barriers. Canadian processors provided engineering assistance and bore testing expenses that would otherwise have made switching uneconomical. The agreements were structured to overcome customer inertia established since 1945 by offering terms substantially better than American suppliers had provided, making the economics of switching clearly favorable, despite sunk integration costs. What makes this systematic removal significant is recognizing that each reason existed specifically because of decisions and investments made beginning in 1945 and compounding over 8 decades. Capital availability advantage began with post-war American capital market dominance. Technical knowledge concentration began with wartime expertise development. Scale economy benefits began with first-mover positioning in post-war reconstruction. Customer entrenchment began with immediate post-war supply relationships. Every reason had 1945 as its origin point, and 80 years of reinforcement making it progressively more formidable. Removing reasons that had existed and compounded since 1945 required investment at scale sufficient to overcome 80 years of accumulated advantage simultaneously rather than attempting to compete incrementally against established positions. This is why the magnitude of capital deployment mattered. Incremental investment would have addressed individual reasons partially while leaving others intact, allowing American control to persist through remaining advantages. Only systematic investment eliminating all reasons simultaneously could end control that had been deliberately constructed in 1945 and systematically reinforced across 8 decades. The result was not Canadian processing that competed at disadvantage against American facilities enjoying advantages from 80 years of accumulated position. The result was elimination of every reason that had made American control rational since its 1945 origins: capital availability matching American accumulation, technical knowledge replicating American expertise, scale capacity matching American volumes, customer relationships overcoming American entrenchment. With every reason eliminated, control that had existed since 1945 simply ceased to exist, because the structural conditions enabling it had been systematically removed. American processing companies acknowledged this removal in congressional testimony, noting that advantages they had enjoyed since the post-war era no longer existed. Capital positions established over decades had been matched through Canadian strategic investment. Technical superiority developed since 1945 had been replicated through Canadian knowledge development. Scale benefits from first-mover positioning had been overcome through Canadian capacity deployment. Customer relationships dating to post-war reconstruction had been contested through Canadian supply commitments. The reasons control had existed since 1945 had been systematically eliminated through comprehensive investment specifically designed to remove each one. The historical significance is that this represents the first successful unwinding of a post-war economic relationship structure deliberately established in 1945 and maintained through compound advantages for 80 consecutive years. Other nations had accepted their positions in post-war economic order as permanent because advantages establishing those positions appeared insurmountable after decades of reinforcement. Canada demonstrated that positions established in 1945, regardless of how entrenched through decades of compounding advantage, can be systematically dismantled through investment at sufficient scale to remove every reason enabling them. For resource-rich nations studying Canadian precedent, the lesson is profound. Economic positions established in post-war order are not permanent features of global economy. They are maintained through specific structural reasons that can be identified and systematically removed through investment at sufficient scale. The capital advantage that seemed permanent because it originated in 1945, capital market dominance, can be eliminated through strategic capital deployment. The knowledge advantage that appeared unassailable because it accumulated over decades can be replicated through systematic expertise development. The scale advantage that looked insurmountable because it derived from first-mover positioning can be matched through capacity investment sized appropriately. The customer entrenchment that seemed unbreakable because it deepened over generations can be overcome through supply agreements structured to make switching economically compelling. What Canada accomplished was not defeating American processors in competition or negotiating better terms within existing arrangements. What Canada accomplished was systematic removal of every reason that American control over Canadian processing had existed since 1945. Not partial mitigation of some advantages, not incremental improvement of competitive position. Complete elimination of all structural reasons through investment explicitly designed to make each reason cease to exist. The reasons that made American processing control rational in 1945 and sustained it through 2024 no longer exist. Capital availability that favored American investment has been matched through Canadian strategic deployment. Technical knowledge that resided exclusively in American operations has been replicated through Canadian expertise development. Scale economies that American facilities enjoyed through first-mover positioning have been achieved through Canadian capacity matched to American volumes. Customer relationships that protected American market positions through switching costs have been overcome through Canadian supply agreements structured to make switching economically favorable. History will record that Canada systematically removed every reason American control over processing of Canadian critical minerals had existed since its 1945 origins through the postwar economic order. The removal was comprehensive rather than partial, simultaneous rather than sequential, and designed specifically to eliminate structural conditions rather than compete within them. With every reason removed, control that had persisted for 80 years ended not because it was defeated in competition, but because the reasons enabling it ceased to exist. The post-war economic order established in 1945 positioned certain nations as processors and others as extractors through specific structural mechanisms. Those mechanisms created reasons that made the arrangement rational and self-perpetuating. Canada has demonstrated that arrangements established in 1945, regardless of how deeply entrenched through decades of compound advantages, can be fundamentally restructured through systematic removal of the reasons sustaining them. The capital deployed was large because the reasons were deeply rooted. The approach was comprehensive because partial removal would have left control intact through remaining reasons. The result is permanent because reasons, once systematically removed through structural investment, cannot spontaneously recreate themselves. By the time most people understand what occurred, the removal will be so thoroughly completed that the reasons will be historical curiosities rather than contemporary realities. This is how economic relationships established in 1945 and sustained through 80 years of compound advantages actually end. Not through incremental reform, but through systematic removal of every structural reason enabling them. The reasons that made American control rational since 1945 have been eliminated. And reasons, once removed through comprehensive structural investment, do not return simply because arrangements they enabled were comfortable for those who benefited from them.